Hey guys, and welcome back to Jung To Live By. Now, first of all, I want to thank you all for your patience over the last couple of weeks or so with the seemingly hiatus in video production. And the reason for that, if you probably tell actually with my very bare backdrop behind myself, is that I've moved house now. I've moved to be close to where Steve and Pauline reside so that we can essentially start season 2 of Jung To Live By with a brand new video setup. Gone are the days of the webcam and Zoom and everything else like that, because we thought, why not up our production value to match what we believe to be the importance of the material that we're trying to get across to you guys. So that's exciting. It's been a strange couple of weeks, to be honest. About 2 weeks without Wi-Fi, which is basically a human rights abuse as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, the next few videos you're going to see on the channel are sort of ones we recorded just before this process. So we've got a few more Ask a Depth Psychologists to go out, and then hopefully by that point, although no promises, we should be ready with our new video setup. So of course that's very exciting, and indeed we've got a few more big announcements to come very, very soon as well. There's been, may not have been videos on the channel for the last couple of weeks, but there's been a lot happening behind the scenes. We're all very excited to announce this stuff to you because I think there's some stuff in there you guys are going to really like. So yeah. Today we've got 3 questions for Ask a Depth Psychologist, and of course, as always, if you want to get involved in that process, you can do so. You're more than welcome to do so. If you sign up at the $10 tier or higher on Patreon, then you can submit a question into our Discord server, and then we'll answer it in as much detail as we possibly can. First question today was all about Deja Vu and what that might mean from a Jungian perspective, because it's something that everyone experiences. It's something which can be profound to people. So, what is it? What is it? It's an exciting question. The second question was all about complexes, which essentially is like, hey guys, I don't have my own lab. I don't have my own sort of medical center. I don't have a capnograph. I've got none of this stuff, but I'd like to identify my own complexes if that's possible. So how do I go about doing this? So, I think we had a good fun answering that question too. And the final question was quite a long one from an individual that clearly put a lot of care and consideration into the question. And it was all about typology. And the basic idea is I'm doing a good job with balancing myself out in terms of typology. I am X type, and I'm looking at my inferior and my tertiary functions, and I'm doing a good job at sort of getting in touch with those so that I balance myself out. But I'm concerned that if I go down this path and I feel like I can do it, and I am doing it, that I might get complacent and I might get kind of chill with the process, and therefore all of the potential that I perceive myself to have, and this individual definitely does have, might not become manifest. And it was described by the guy as an individuation short circuit, and I quite like that phrase. So so I guess thank you everybody, and without any further ado, I'll kick the first question to Steve in the not too recent past, and it goes as such. What is déjà vu from the Jungian perspective? Is it merely the psyche catching on to abstract patterns to make predictions, or is it accessing what is pre-programmed and thus confirming the idea of destiny?
Yeah, interesting question. I think it's fair to say that if you give a Jungian perspective, then you need to know the context of a specific. Other than that, it's difficult to give a blanket response in terms of it being Jungian. These things definitely happen, and it is a matter of resolution with respect to how you conceive of a whole situation before you can give a proper response to that. In a clinical sense, then, I think we've said before that the more in depth you work, the more likely things like this start to stack up. And then déjà vus as such would begin to blend into synchronicities, which would then begin to blend into paranormal or parapsychological phenomenon, and that this is normal when you're working in depth clinically. So that can happen. With respect to everyday life, we all experience it, but then there's an issue of attribution. What do we attribute the cause to that to be? And for that, you really do need to understand the context of the person and the situation. Otherwise, you will potentially just become reductive in whichever response that you take to that, either by saying, yes, this is paranormal, or no, it's not, it's just simple pattern recognition, because both of those hypotheses are in and of themselves valid in a general sense, but to resolve it down to a specific, that's different and that must involve the whole context. Now, as you say, with a depth psychology context, you have to add in the unconscious, perception by way of the unconscious as Jung conceived of it. And then to get into a synchronistic element, you need to look even deeper than that in terms of the meaning that can be ascribed to it, either directly from consciousness or that emerges spontaneously from within, with that sense of certainty that these things have for people who experience them. That's part of why they report them. So yeah, it could be any of those things, and it really does depend upon the context. So you really do know what it is you're looking at with the highest possible level of confidence before you make a response on it. But in broad terms, yes, it could be any of those, but context specific. What do you think, Love? We've experienced these things all the time ourselves, don't we?
Yeah, we do indeed. I think you're right to say it's context specific. Otherwise, it's hard to assign any kind of meaning to the content, isn't it? And as with all things, particularly clinical things, the individual context is important, and what the content might mean for that person at that moment in their life. So it does come back to that. Yeah.
I mean, deja vu, that sense of this has happened before.
Yeah.
In my own experience, that's happened when something has happened externally and I've remembered a dream that appears to mirror it that happened earlier. So it was a kind of a confirmation of an apparent precognition, if you like, that then materializes back into consciousness as a sense of deja vu. That's happened a lot, and it all depends on the level of activation of my own psyche. And I may not even be paying conscious attention to that as such. And this is probably normal for most people who experience it. But when it's activated, you do get that connection, and it then becomes a whole situation, which you relate to cognitively and emotionally, intuitively, and even through your sensing function.
Yeah.
Because the environment may suddenly turn up in intensity in relation to a dream, which may have had a particular level of intensity. So you get all of these correspondences occurring at the same time. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's just a thought that drifts into your mind, some vagary that, yeah, this has happened before, or something like it has happened before. You do get skeptical parapsychologists, professional skeptics, who seem to enjoy doing everything they can to reductively debunk this kind of thing, as they do with all such so-called parapsychological phenomenon. I accept them for who and what they are in their context, but I don't see a correspondence between that context and, say, clinical work, because they never go there. It's territory that they never touch. And there's probably something about their mindset that determines the kind of results they get from their experiments, and also something about their mindset that determines how they interpret things a priori to the experiences anyway. So I guess that if I was to give any sort of opinion on it, it would be take things as they happen and look for the context, and then resolve for yourself something that fits with the overall situation as far as you can.
We have got a second question now from Nightchild, and he asks, in the absence of a capnography test, how does one identify a complex? Is this done through the personal myth exclusively, or can it be done through analysing symptomatology that exists somewhere on the biopsychosocial level? In other words, what do you look for to identify the specific complex that needs to be addressed in an individual?
Okay, if that's a clinical situation you're referring to, then assessment is important, and it's layered. You can go on the case history the anamnesis has reported, and you abstract out from that simply on a symptomatic basis, also on the presentation of the person. You can do a formal assessment, and you, James, are familiar with how they're done in this approach. They're very, very structured, go beyond anything CBT has to offer, for example, very, very detailed. He said in the absence of capnography would be more to do with searching deeper once you've got some information, perhaps. But you could use word association tests as an example. With respect to the personal myth, then that will be a kind of archaeology, if you like, that a person has undergone to extend their conscious awareness of what may have contributed to a specific complex. So all of those things can play their part. Again, it just depends upon the presentation in the moment, but very often, and you will know this, James, because of the training that you're going through, that perception of a person broadly in terms of just about everything about them, including how they emit energy in person to you, how they move, how they posture themselves, the emotional inflection in their voice, eye movements, everything, all of this can give you a real-time read on the presence of a complex, and then in how they speak, because you can detect quite easily that the presence of active complexes within a pattern of speech that a person makes, and very often that person is unconscious of the fact that the complex is simultaneously present and filtering and distorting what they're saying, because complexes will present themselves in such a way, if you like, as to say, I'm here but you can't see me, both to the person who's suffering from them and also as a challenge to the therapist, because they'll be embedded in that person's totality, their physicality of being, what they're saying, all of these things. And it's as if it wants to say, I'm here but you can't see me, and if you point me out, I'll just disappear back into the unconscious of this person, and they'll deny that it's there as well. But over long clinical experience, you get used to this. It's as if you're encountering the same phenomenon, albeit it's being expressed through the individuality of the person that you're with. So a lot of these things are very valid. Sorry, Paul, you're going to say?
No, I was reminded as you were talking really about, certainly for women with respect to animus possession, there are definite characteristics or qualities to do with speech, like you say, for example, that can be detected. So sometimes women who are animus possessed will talk in a loud, insistent kind of way with a almost a masculine quality to their voice. The tone of their voice might lower, for example, and obviously there are characteristic things that they tend to say as well. But I think you're right, Steve. You have to look at how these things are embedded in the way that people present themselves, and you have to be literally respond to that on a moment by moment basis, because if it's a complex and it's ego identified, essentially that person has no consciousness that they're doing it.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So it's a kind of it's almost like a real-time analysis of what is going on, and when very often when you point these things out, people are quite surprised by it, because essentially they think, they and it are one. They are identical in effect.
Yeah,
but
good point. Yeah, but when you can help somebody to catch it out real time in themselves, it's often an enlightening moment for them. That they actually see that this thing has been speaking them or behaving them in that moment. Typology is not a good way to catch out complexes, because a person's expressed type will conceal just as often as it reveals what a complex is, although you should consider that the typology is just the medium of expression of deeper structures within the personality and does not itself define them. So, for example, if somebody is thinking introverted dominance, and a certain kind of ego-identified complex takes over that function, then the person is going to be completely unaware of it. And that will be difficult to help that person to see that what they thought were their own thoughts are not theirs at all, but they're being directed to think in a particular way that includes a confirmation bias that protects the complex from scrutiny by the introverted thinking function. Because introverted thinking likes to think in polarities. It enjoys them. It enjoys dialectic. And the problem with that is that when you get a resolution to a polarity, it tends to produce another, if you like, Hegelian hypothesis or thesis. Then you get an antithesis and so on. And so introverted thinking types can be locked in that kind of circular logic that just reproduces itself continuously. So if you get a complex that seizes hold of that, that's very, very difficult for an introverted thinking dominant type of person to disidentify from. So in that sense, typology doesn't help. On the other hand, as well, when people answer things like the Myers-Briggs, it could well be a complex that's answering it. And by a complex, I could mean something as prosaic or ordinary, if you like, as the maladaptation to a family or to an influential member of the family will then shape a person's perception of themselves and then shape the expression of their personality, but it's not their true personality at all. Also, typology is not character. The difference, character is deeper than personality type. So you have to be really careful about using typology to identify complexes, perhaps except to say that the type can express the complex in a hidden form. Although you can make a prediction where the type is accuracy enough about how a person will break down under pressure. But that's taking somebody who is normal under normal conditions, if you like, statistical conditions, who then becomes overwhelmed and will fracture according to the lines of their adapted type. But what you do see is that the person who is so fracturing doesn't see it. Other people will see it first. You know, it's a difficult one overall, but it's a really good question, Nightchild. Really good.
Yeah. I think those are good answers as well, guys. I want to bolster that actually because of what I've seen with some guys in the Discord, not Nightchild, but clinically, obviously, you are looking for complexes. And we have those assessment sheets, which you pointed out, Steve, which some of the students, whatever, have access to as well. But I think it's possible to develop a complex, if you see what I mean. Well, I see some guys, and I see some of the emails and DMs and everything else being like, I think I have this complex, how do I solve it? I think I've got it. So the analysis starts from the idea of complex and works down, rather than say symptoms and works down. But the idea of, say, this stuff from a self-development perspective, which is a large part of these videos, it's one of the reasons why we make them, I have several of them, is to become better adapted by a psychosocially. Essentially. So it's like, in which ways am I maladapted? In which ways am I not happy? In which ways am I misfiring in all different directions? Rather than start from a complex, start from symptom and then work down to see what the root might be.
Absolutely.
They could clear something up for some guys as well, which the impression I get from some guys does seem to be, well, I've got to eliminate mother, father, again, it falls into that sort of strange video game model. So, to complexes can form their own complexes too.
It all becomes very theoretical at that point, doesn't it? And the application, which is important, of course it is, to understand things theoretically, but you also need the application of it as well, and you need to be able to see these things as they're operating in your everyday life. And it can be tricky, can't it? It can be very, very tricky. Particularly, like I say, if it's an identified complex, because essentially you and it are one of the same thing, and you won't make that conscious distinction. It will only be other, people really who see it.
Yeah. In terms of assessments and that structured system that we've been using for 30 years, at least, isn't it? For probably a bit longer than that. Then one of the things that it highlights is that you can't really reduce a complex down, although it's highly structured. You might, for example, get the negative anima complex operating in the area of the mother complex, and at the same time operating in another area. So what are you actually looking at? And then it turns out usually it's an issue of relating, which involves other complexes wrapped around it. So you're right, James, and what Pauline has said too, that you need to look at how a thing presents before you resolve that down to a structure. Because the theory in itself can get in the way of not only your understanding, but also how you will help a person to tackle something. So it's always in the moments, it's got to be flexible. And then eventually the theory will emerge to explain the observation. You do not try to process the observation, if you like, through a theory. Except in this case where that structured analysis and breakdown of complexes is concerned, that it forces you to see the bandwidth of your observations, which is actually paradoxically a very important thing to do, using structure like that, so you can become flexible and then avoid that trap of falling into a duality that this is that complex and not that one. It's always a bigger picture than that.
This next question comes from Kiro. It's quite a long one, so we might have to settle in. It's quite an interesting one, though, very typological. It begins with, regarding typology, how does one know when one's opposite type brings value to one's life rather than lead to short-circuiting the individuation process? Context, My type is ENTJ, opposite type being ISFP. Recently, I've gotten better at integrating my lower functions, partly by listening to instinctual pressures, but also by following the footsteps of individuals with opposite and different types than me. I did this through NLP modeling, recommended by Steve. Thank you. I've gotten better at seeing my extroverted thinking for what it is, and instead I'm finding use for both my extroverted sensing and my introverted feeling. For example, regarding rest, creativity, and enjoying the smaller things in life. This has helped in reducing my suffering and brought me some enjoyment out of life. I no longer am burnt out like I used to be. My efficiency and my output of action has increased now that I've cultivated the habit of proper rest for once. I'm also spending more time at peace and at ease. This has brought value to my life, partly through leaning into my opposite type and trying to integrate my lower functions. Well, that sounds fantastic, Hiro, so well done.
Yeah, it does, yeah, brilliant.
However, my question is, to what extent is it conducive to keep leaning into these opposite and different types of attitudes? My suspicion and my worry is that I might fall prey to a, quote, individuation short circuit, end quote, settling for less and allowing for latent potential to build again. That at some point I might think that I've integrated all of my functions and that, quote, life is okay as it is, end quote, and that, quote, I'm complete as I am, end quote. The individuation journey never ends, I know this, and according to my personal myth, I seem to have a lot of potential. I'm worried that if I squander it, myself and other people will suffer unnecessarily because of this individuation short circuit, leading to an increase of my latent potential. So how does one tread this path without falling prey to this short-circuiting the individuation process? Thank you. I'll let you two take this question.
Well, that's a hell of a question, and it's in many different dimensions, which is appropriate, really, because people are like that. They're in many, many different dimensions. Typology, if you emphasize it, brings its own problems because it forestalls by its nature the way that we perceive things. That's why I recommended it, and he's followed the recommendation, which is great. Thank you for that, to look at NLP modeling. Not because NLP is superior in any way to Jungian theory, but it does offer some skills which are absent in the general Jungian approach. In that sense, then, I would suggest that he goes on as he is. It's going to be a lifelong journey. He's going to need to engage with life fully, find out where the resistances are in life to him as a personality, and the resistances within, and then engage on a step-by-step basis with those resistances in order to develop himself further. But I wouldn't worry, you know, he can't short-circuit individuation. You just can't. It's something that happens or it doesn't. And if it does happen, it's a dynamic process. There will be fits and starts, but definitely just engage with it. One thing I would say is that one of the problems with a broadly psychodynamic approach to life is that it backs away from its physicality. It's too cerebral. There's also a bias generally in favor of introversion, and I'm an introvert. But I've learned over the years the value not only of extroversion, but also of physically engaging with life in an integrated way. To do that, then, you would need to stop identifying, perhaps as closely as we might, with a theoretical view of life, which, if we're not careful, will just shift into a philosophy, an idea about things rather than the doing of it. Engage fully with it. Engage fully in some sense with your physicality, with your physical actions as being a human being engaged with your biology, if you like, properly. And then work on the alchemy of bringing those two together in an integrated way. If you're too physical without any mental, spiritual development, that's not going to work either, at least not as effectively, and vice versa. So engage fully with life. But where there is one drawback with a lot of the Jungian approaches is that they sit down too much, like in a chair like this, and don't do enough physically to engage not only with the environment, but with their own instincts. That's true for introverts as much as it is for extroverts. So yeah, find out where the resistances are within yourself. And you seem to have identified one already. Really, I think what you're describing is the fact that there's almost too much theory, and there's a need behind that to actualize yourself through action. And that action is a heroic thing, and it will involve rising and falling, rising and falling. It's a waveform through your life. So great what you've done. That's absolutely brilliant. And I'm made up to hear that you've done that. And yeah, NLP modeling is very effective, and it has its analogues in the East in Tantrism, for example, which are surprisingly close. So yeah, very effective, but it will also give you a really good grounding in the senses as well, psychologically. And that should lead to a more fuller grounding, perhaps, in the physicality of engagement with the world, which is very, very important, I would say.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Steve. I mean, I know it's a gentleman here asking the question, but I think it's true for women as well, particularly in terms of their animus development, the positive animus development, that they take action and initiative too in the real world and in a physical way. I mean, I know that both men and women, for example, enjoy these days going to the gym and working out, and they can be physical in that way. But I think you're talking about a different kind of physicality. And I was only thinking recently, for example, about the women in the First and Second World War. I was telling you about it, about the Women's Land Army, for example, so that when the men were away fighting, and this, included hundreds of thousands of women at the time, were employed by farmers to work the land, and they would chop down trees and operate sawmills. They'd plough the fields. They'd bring in crops, they do lambing, they do all kinds of things. But the thing that impacted me the most was the physicality of all of that, and their action and initiative in the world. And from what I understand about it, they didn't particularly lose the femininity either.
They didn't. That was clear.
That was quite clear. So I think, like you're saying, Steve, you need that balance, don't you, between developing yourself psychologically and maybe spiritually, and also having a physical dimension to your life as well, which is creative, and which will build you and sustain you in a different way, in a different direction. But I think it has to be the two.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's the idea of it being meaningful physicality as well, in some sense.
Yes.
That's important.
Yeah.
Very, very important.
Yeah.
And it's one of the drawbacks of some forms of Eastern meditation, is that they are too withdrawing from the world and lack engagement with it. And you get that in some of the Western mystery traditions. And I would add depth psychology to that, because in many ways, depth psychology has grown out of Western mystery traditions. And it is too cerebral sometimes, and does lack activity. I mean, Jung himself did act upon the world. He did sculpt, he did chop wood, and he was creative in that sense. And that was fine for him in his environment, and in his day and in his time. But there are some people who are set even more towards the physical beyond that, or the need for it. And there are some Eastern traditions that are aware of that, and always have been, and have utilized physicality in order to bring the spiritual into the world. But that's a question of an advanced form of Tantrism, which I'm not aware of, in the sense that it should have a correlate in the West, which is a shame. Meaningful activity and engagement that is constructive with the environment is very, very helpful.
Yeah. It is, and for women again, who obviously not all women, but a lot of young women these days seem to be almost overly concerned about their appearance, about breaking a nail or whatever it might be, and I think because of that, because it creates a kind of almost a fragility of mind, which you could argue is also one way in which the animus can form in a woman too, where she's kind of in a kind of a fantasy world and a kind of a daydreamy state where she doesn't actually engage and interact with the real world in any kind of meaningful way, that some form of physicality is important, and to not just leave that to the world of men, that it's men who do those kinds of things and not women, and somehow they should just be tended to and cared for and nurtured, because they're kind of this sort of fragile sort of thing, and they can't engage with those sorts of things. But like I say, though, you only have to look to the past to see how women have done these things and have demonstrated that they can do these things, and just how good they are for women as well, psychologically, to be involved in.
Yeah. What we're seeing now is different though, isn't it? Because it's polluted with a political ideology, which is catabolic.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not producing anything of value other than the phenomenon of shit testing against men, and also broadly the degradation of culture.
Yeah.
If you want to destroy a culture, then go for the women, get them to destroy themselves, and then the whole thing will start to collapse.
Yeah.
That's the way to do it, even more than with the men. And this is understood in the East. It's understood in Tibet, for example, how they utilize the negative masculine energy. They have cultural ways of doing that. And most societies can do that. But once women start to become catabolic in an unstructured way, so the whole thing just starts to descend, then the very foundations of a culture and a civilization will become eroded to the point where they collapse. And yet what happened in the Second World War was a maximal emergency in terms of civilization and its survival, but it was handled completely differently. Completely. There's a lesson in that, but then the way the political climate is going, it seems people aren't supposed to have an ancestral memory, even if that's only 70 or 80 years ago. Yeah. History is to be obliterated.
Yeah.
Terrible, absolutely terrible.
Yeah, it's a great shame, because you can lose so much by not looking to the past.
And your instincts will insist that you recover that. And if they can't come out legitimately, they'll come out in an exaggerated, illegitimate form, because instinctive pressure demands that ego consciousness adapts both to it and also to the environment. And if there's a failure to adapt either way, as to instincts or to culture or to the natural environment, then you get a massive increase in neurosis, massive. And it can start to manifest on a cultural level. And it's happening, of course. We all know this, it's happening, it's manifest.